everyone, this is Maggie Thrasher with Thrasher Aquatics, and today we're going to be doing a 10-gallon build that is going to be river inspired. Right here I am cleaning out some old air plants that one of my friends used as packing material with one of my last snakes, and they've just kind of been sitting in this tank, you know, incubating for a while. And here I'm going to go through and clean up some of the old algae and things from the time this tank was previously used. And I'm using mostly just water in the beginning to scrub everything down with a paper towel. And then I'm going to go in afterwards with a bit of vinegar to break down some of these hard water spots. While I'm going through this, I can kind of explain the hot mess that is happening over here on the right side of the tank. Basically, this is what happens when you put a tank directly in a window. So learn from us and do not do that. Basically, what's going on is it's having an outbreak of blue-green algae, which is pretty difficult to treat once it gets past a certain point. Like in the earlier stages, you can easily just remove little pieces of it and it'll, you know, it'll mostly stay away, but we had a bit of a sick spell and it just took over. So while we're redoing all these tanks, we will be redoing that tank over there to the right and making sure that it's nice and clean for the fish involved. You can see here I'm continuing just to scrub down the glass, and I think this is where I break in the vinegar. The vinegar is going to break down those hard water spots by using an acidic solution to break down the calcium. I kind of let it sit for a few minutes and then I go in with another paper towel, scrub it down, try to get as much off as I can, and then I'll just go through and spray it down with some nice cool water just to rinse it all out, make sure there's no vinegar left or anything like that. Something to keep in mind is that I am not using any sort of soap or detergent or anything like that to clean the tank, because I want to make sure that it's completely safe for whatever inhabitants I put in here. Now I'm putting a small sponge in the back just to conserve the amount of sand that I'm using. We're using all just extra materials to build these tanks, so we want to make sure that we're using as little as possible, so that little sponge will just keep me from having to put 2 more scoops of sand in there. I'm creating a bit of a shelf in the back so it's deeper in the back for the stem plants, as well as giving the tank a bit of depth since we're doing a very long scape here. I'm putting down a small bed of sand before I put any hardscape in here to protect the glass, as well as give it something to settle into so it sits flat and is not wobbling around as much. Here I'm just adding more sand behind the wood, using it as a bit of a shelf itself, but I'm actually going to decide to switch out this wood here in a second and go for something a little bit that fits the scape a little bit better. I'm being extremely careful when I pick this wood out of the tank because it is heavy and I definitely do not want to drop it on that bottom glass. Here, this piece of wood has a lot of flat pieces, so I'm going to try to situate one of those flat pieces against the edge of the tank and make it look a little bit more natural. Because, you know, in the wild, wood doesn't have perfectly cut, sawed, flat places on it. I'm using some stones here to prop the wood against the glass, as well as create a bit of a shelf to separate the sand in the back from the next substrate I'm going to put up front. As I'm putting all of this in, I'm making sure that it's really secure and that it's not going to wobble around and hurt any animals that may be put in here. Then I pour the sand right on top of the wood, which is going to cause some issues later, so try to avoid that or get a paintbrush and try to get it off before you pour water in there, because it's just going to create a mess. You can see I'm continuing the shelf in the back using the piece of wood as part of the barrier. And I've put a little bit of wood up front as well to kind of block some of the holes that the wood has created against the glass and give it more of a natural look when we're done. Next, I'm going to continue putting these river stones as a shelf against the sand, just trying to keep the substrates more separated in the future and make my life a little easier as this tank ages. I'm trying to use a variety of shapes and sizes to make it look more natural. As well as coloration, you don't see one color of stone in the wild, so we tried to mix it up a little bit as we were putting this together. Up front, I'm putting some pea gravel that I did not properly clean. Learn from me, you see that dust popping up, and it's going to create a nice cloudy water for me later. This river stone was a mix of me trying to conserve sand as well as putting a little bit of a different texture up front and leaning into that river bit with these smoothed pebbles. You can see I've covered up most of that stone shelf in the front, but it's still going to act really well as a barrier to keep that sand away from the front. Here I am planting some Kambamba. It is a nice stem plant that doesn't need very much lighting, as well as creating a nice purple color in those higher lights. And since I'm using a shop light on this tank, it is going to have a good bit of light on it. This here is Brazilian Pennywort, a very easy low-tech stem that I recommend to most beginner aquarists. I'm trying to plant these long stems in the back to create that depth as well as make sure that anything in the front is still nice and visible as these grow in. Up next is some AR. Normally we see the mini variety in this more often, but this is also a pretty popular one under the name of Scarlet Temple usually. I'm putting this in the back corner. I'm going to try to use it to block some of the filter as well as give a nice pop of color in the back that should grow nice and tall. Up next is some Anubias Frozeri. These are rhizome plants, so they do not need their roots buried and prefer that the rhizomes stay above the sand. If you were to bury this plant, it's more likely to rot and then you just don't have a plant anymore. So I'm wedging these roots in between the wood and the stones here, taking care not to smush the rhizome. You can see I'm just putting a couple of pebbles on top of it, trying to keep it wedged without using those big heavy stones. This here is an Anubias Folia. It's actually one of my favorites. It gets very nice, big, ruffly leaves that really just stand out in an aquarium. They're also one of the faster growing Anubias, which is really satisfying to see. Next up is some Anubias Nana Petite. This is the smallest variety of Anubias, and I'm sticking this into little wedges in the stone just to give it a little bit of texture in there. Learn from me here, and you probably want to use a little bit of aquarium safe super glue because it does take me a good bit of time to get these wedged in and they do end up coming out afterwards, so I'm gonna have to glue them down anyway. You can also use a cotton thread or anything like that just to attach it until the roots get into the wood and then you can remove it. This here is I believe this is a red lotus. Yeah, this is a red lotus. This tiger lotus gets nice big red leaves with splotches in it, but I do believe that this lotus ended up dying off in the adjustment period of this tank. That happens occasionally, but we do try to use hardy plants that fit the environment to minimize that. Next up, I'm just sticking some Java moss into the wood as well as underneath some of these pebbles to create kind of a Java moss carpet up front. And this is something that I hadn't tried before, so I wasn't entirely sure how it would work out, but it turned out really great. And as time goes on, things are filling in, it's starting to look less like clumps and more like a nice grass, which is really neat. I never really thought I could do that with moss. I'm just taking little pieces of it and then sticking it underneath a few pebbles to hold it down. And then showering a few on top just to keep it there. And that is the planting of this. I'm going to fill this tank as slowly as I can using a pump and 5-gallon buckets. I'm shoving it into the corner of the tank to try to keep it from displacing all the plants that I just put in. As I'm filling up this last little bit here, you can see my decision not to properly wash that pea gravel come back to bite me, as we have nice and cloudy water now. Had I decided to properly clean things before I did this, we would have a nice clear slate to look at. My last touch is some Azolla that I'm adding as a floater to the top of this. That did quickly get taken over by some duckweed. Unfortunately, duckweed likes to grow a lot faster than any kind of other floater, and a lot of times can strangle them out, especially if it's something as small and delicate as Azolla. I'm sitting here trying to get some of the sand off afterwards, and this is why I recommended earlier that you try to get the sand off before you fill it, because you can see that I'm creating a huge mess with that. Here is my cycled filter. I am going to be putting this behind the wood, behind some plants, and just trying to hide it. And then I'm attaching that to an air pump that I've got running this entire fish room. And that is that. Thank you so much for watching this tank build. I am really excited to put together more for everyone and give everyone some new ideas and inspiration for these smaller tanks. If you wouldn't mind, give us a like, a subscribe. Maybe check out our other socials. We do a lot with different plants, animals, exotics, things like that, and we always like to keep in touch with those who are watching. So thank you very, very much. Again, this is Maggie Thrasher with Thrasher Aquatics, and I hope you have a fantastic day.